they've lost the AT&T deal, so they're not going to get any work, obviously, from AT&T. That would account for some of it. And this time last year, they still had that contract, it seems. So that's a really bad comparison for them in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing you've got to remember is they don't serve at Verizon anymore. They lost Verizon back in, I think, 2019, 2020. They had this... it was the first of the 5G upsets, really, when... I mean, this is very much due to product competitiveness, which I'm not sure this recent loss is. But that one definitely was, I think.
So what is their main gig T-Mobile then? So
their main gig's T-Mobile. They're about 50-50, I think, with Ericsson and T-Mobile. But it suggests that... I mean, it's very hard to tell whether T-Mobile is... And it's not something I have to say that I asked Pekka Lundmark. You know, you only get 10 minutes, and I didn't go, is T-Mobile spending? He probably wouldn't have told me anyway.
Yeah.
When it's a market itself that where they've got several operators, they're more prepared to comment on it. But if it's a market where they only have one customer, they're probably not going to tell you. So it's almost not worth asking. But is T-Mobile spending a lot on equipment? In which case, the two beneficiaries would obviously be Nokia and Ericsson.
Mm-hmm.
It's really hard to tell.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're back in the studio after being in Paris, and we got Ian back. Very ably deputised by your colleague Teresa last week.
Yeah, did a really good job.
Yeah, no, she was great. And it's just the two of us. In fact, just the two of us. In fact, next week we might even have to do a remote one.
Oh, no.
Because the office is closed on the Friday, and Pierre's dicking about in Barcelona, aren't you?
Nice for work, but yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to assess how closed it will be, though, because we've been here when it was fully closed.
Well, is it closed? Yeah. When we came in during the pandemic. That was the previous office.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were like literally the only people in the whole building.
So you think that the closure might still allow us to get in and use this
Well, this
studio?
is what Pierre's speculating.
Well, I think they're doing maintenance, so we don't want to be here drilling and stuff either. So
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, well, can we...
I'll send an email.
Can we put you in charge of finding out?
Yeah.
Producer Pierre.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's
Cool.
what producers do, isn't it?
That's exactly. Do some fucking producing.
Find out about the drilling.
How loud would it be? What model of drills?
He thinks being a producer is just pressing the red button on the camera and then dicking about on his phone for 2 hours. I don't mean it, Pierre. I'm only joking. So yes. So that's about the only thing that I've been up to since we last podded together. Was
Paris.
Paris was cool. Yeah. We did go out one time. In fact, you saw him next day. Alex and is it Mark Henry? Is that his name?
Yep.
Yeah, they took me and Teresa out for dinner.
BT.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, yes, Alex Jackman and Mark Henry from BT. Mark Henry's like a senior
network strategy director, I think.
Yeah, senior. I was going to call him a senior techie.
Mm.
And Alex, a senior comms person, and they're both good lads. And we had a really nice meal. Slightly off the beaten track. Alex got a recommendation from a mate.
Up at the Eiffel Tower, was it, or something?
No, it's just in some bit of Paris that you wouldn't normally imagine you'd go out to if you were a tourist.
Yeah.
It's quite residential. But it was a really nice restaurant. And we had a good giggle.
He sent me a photo of what he was eating.
Right.
Which I couldn't figure out what it was, but he said it tasted good.
He and I shared a...
Frog legs?
Côte de Boeuf, is it?
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this was a separate course. It must have been the starter. Looked soupy.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I can't remember what he had to start.
Yeah.
But yeah, we shared a big load of beef.
Right.
Which was nice. So that's all I've been up to, really, in terms of being out and about in the 2 weeks since we last podded together. Have you done anything noteworthy?
I went to Tottenham Hotspur Stadium to watch not football, but American
football.
It was the Jacksonville Jaguars against the Chicago Bears.
Who were you the guest of?
I was with, so it's very nicely arranged by Golin, the PR agency, and Verizon.
Right.
Who they're representing. So they had a couple of guys over, Leighton and Sanjeev, who are sort of on the Verizon business EMEA side of things. And they're obviously kind of into doing stadium stuff.
Fair enough.
You know, it's one of the opportunities for telcos to play in
for Verizon, because Verizon, its representation outside of the US is Verizon Business, isn't it?
Yeah,
where
it
it's
is.
B2B comms.
Yeah, and how they fit into the stadium stuff wasn't entirely clear to me, because obviously a lot of the UK telcos would have that wrapped up, and they've got the spectrum, but there are things they can do.
Private networks or something like that.
Yeah, it's more sort of almost on like a sort of managed services IT side of things, but they were doing. I mean, one thing I found quite interesting they were chatting about a little bit was this comm system they put in for this match that allowed the coach to communicate with the quarterback.
Right.
Which I didn't realise that happened in American football.
Well, they've had variations of it.
Doing this
well, they've had variations.
Yeah,
They have an earpiece.
Yes, they have an earpiece now.
They've had variations of that for years.
Ago,
I mean, it used to be
recent.
it used to be Motorola kit they used like 10, 20 years
I
ago.
knew the coach had something, but I thought he had eyes above.
He's got eyes above, but you can also they also use it to communicate with the quarterback in the field. Yeah.
I wonder if it's in the helmet.
It's in the helmet. I think it's in the helmet. Yeah. So you see him sort of doing this occasionally. I mean, I didn't actually because I was.
The coach going, lob the fucking ball at someone.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird that the quarterback doesn't decide. Because I know. I mean, yeah.
I mean, maybe he.
I
don't know.
It's such a different game, American football, because it's stop-start.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's nothing like what we're used to, flowing games like soccer or tennis or whatever, where it's all just individuals just being athletic and thinking on their feet and all that sort of thing. Every play.
It's strategic.
Yeah, it's more like a chess move.
Yeah, well, someone said that at the event.
And then the sad thing is, about 3/4 of the play is a complete waste of time. They're trying to run it. He just runs into a big pile of extremely strong and heavy men.
Yeah.
And then you have to wait another 5 minutes before they get going again.
Yeah. Meanwhile, this poor quarterback's just getting charged down left, right, and centre.
Right.
He's got no idea what's going on because he's looking for someone to throw the ball to. But I think they call it blindsided, don't they? You know that you just
well, I mean, I actually do. I've been an American football fan since the 80s, so. A subtle hint to Golan and Verizon. I actually like American football, if you're listening, so just fucking bear that in mind.
Yeah, I had no idea what was going on.
And, you have...
You're like, flag, what's happening? Yeah.
You basically have a quarterback, and in front of them there's 5 big lads called the offensive line.
Yeah.
And it's basically their job. They got 2 jobs. One is to stop the other savages from getting to the quarterback, and the other one's to try and make holes in the line so the running back can run through.
Well, do you know what I was surprised about? Is the stadium was full to capacity.
Yeah,
and I
a lot of people, Americans travel,
and they obviously close the street, don't they, to traffic outside. They close that down to traffic. So the pubs along the along that street. I can't remember the name of the road. It's not White Hart Lane.
No, it's Tottenham High Road, something like that.
Were just full of people, standing outside as well with plastic cups, and it was quite a nice day. Sunday, it was quite sunny, so it's sort of quite a nice atmosphere.
I mean, Tottenham,
not what I was expecting.
Tottenham, bless it, isn't the most swanky neighbourhood in London.
Oh my god,
it's not. Shut up, Gooner.
No, it's really bad. Come on.
Well, it's just a normal blue collar, not very shiny bit of London.
Fine though.
But yeah, when I've been to Spurs. As often as not, it's for like gigs and stuff. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of pubs you can get because the public transport's quite shit to that area.
Yeah,
you have to get either the tube to.
Well, I went to
Seven Sisters, and that's quite a long walk, isn't it? It's about
I got
20
there
minutes.
Really early, so I did go to a pub before I went in.
Yeah.
I got a pint of Guinness.
You go to Beehive.
£4.90. No, I don't think it was the Beehive.
Beehive's one of the ones on the way.
Bit past it. I did go past the Beehive. I remember seeing that.
But it's obviously, all the pubs there. It's very much Tottenham. You don't want to go in there with like making Gooner noises.
Well, you're not allowed.
I mean,
and
I think
vice versa.
They wouldn't have cared on this weekend. But,
no, that's true.
I mean, they were like Bears tops on. It's Chicago Bears. Apparently, it was a home game for Chicago Bears.
Yeah,
which I didn't really
understand.
Counterintuitive.
Yeah. Well, they've really expanded it. I mean, I went to the first ever NFL game.
Me too.
Did you?
Giants against the Dolphins.
That's
2006.
Right. Shit game.
Yeah, it was raining, muddy, horrible.
Oh, you went to the same one? Yeah, I went there. I took my little Jack, who's now 20. I took him at age about 4. And bless him, he got freaked out. They had all these pyrotechnics at the start and he got scared.
We might have been sat next to each other.
God, yeah.
Was that before you knew each other?
Well,
yeah. Way before.
16 years.
Yeah.
God.
18
I was just thinking, who's that smooth French fellow?
You were looking at him from a distance.
Do you remember who scored the only touchdown of the game?
I don't.
It was Eli Manning. He just went on his own.
He just like quarterback sneak or something. Yeah. Yes, no, that's disappointing because I'm a Dolphins fan.
Did you know your wife then? Was that
yeah.
before? You did, okay.
Yeah, it was 2007, sorry. That was 2007.
All right. Anyway, sorry. We digress. Okay, so that's what we've been at. That sounds good fun. But yeah, it is a bit of a slog when you see an American football game live. I mean, when you watch it in the States, that's basically an excuse to put on about a stone.
Yeah.
Because, you put on the American because there's so many stops that you just get pizza and you get your chicken wings, you get your beers, your nachos, or whatever.
There was a lot of that going around.
Really and you're just sitting there filling in the gaps.
Yeah. Baseball is the same. You barely glance at it.
Right, you're too busy eating hot dogs and
Yeah, there was a good spread and there was a good sort of drink selection. And a Negroni even.
Oh wait, could you?
Oh, you had a Negroni.
Yeah.
Could you drink at your seat? Because that's not
you could. Yes, you could.
A Premier League game.
You could drink at your seat. You could drink at your seat. I mean, I think it was in. Yeah, they put it in plastic. But
Different rules.
I do seem to remember drinking at my seat. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, not a problem.
But yeah, the best way to actually watch the sport is basically sort of condensed highlights where they just cut out, because you have a play. You know, for people who don't know anything about American football, they have a play and then they stop the clock usually, or even if they don't stop the clock, they have about a couple of minutes to get their shit together for the next one. So, and the play can take like 10 seconds. So you've basically got an enormous amount of the typically 3 hours of a game.
Yeah.
So it's a 1 hour game on the clock, but the games typically take 3 or 4 hours. So you just got an enormous amount of dead time in American football. That's why it's best to watch it as extended highlights.
Yeah.
Anyway, cool. What are we going to chat about this week? I think the obvious one, Ian, is that this week we had both Ericsson and Nokia's quarterlies.
Yeah, it would be a shame if we didn't talk about that.
We'd be a bit remiss. And you know, the other thing about talking that, other than the fact that they're two of the biggest and most relevant companies in our sector, is that they're also sort of barometers for the industry. And I might, I might have some tangents about whether the industry's sort of whether the telecoms recession, as I call it, is bottoming out. It's very speculative at this stage, but then fuck it, that's what we do. That's what we're paid to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we can talk a bit about that, and I think there might be one or two other tangents that we go on that. So that's going to take up most of the time. But we got a couple of other things. If we're disciplined enough, we can make time for you. You've written about the Vodafone 3 deal from the point of view of the current network sharing arrangements and how that's going to be reconciled.
Yeah, that's. I mean. Yeah, we could do that, or we could talk about 6G as it.
It
plays in the sort of Ericsson Nokia stuff.
Okay, well that might come in. That might come in the main segment. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, put a pin in that and make sure to bring up the 6G angle. And then if we have time, I've got more of my sort of more self-indulgent thing, which was a story I wrote about them. They're trying to put a law through in England banning smartphones in schools, and I think that's a bullshit law. And I can tell you why. So that's that. But let's get straight into it. Did you write up both the Nokia and the Ericsson numbers?
I did.
Okay. Well, why don't we start? I didn't write the Nokia ones, and they're just fresh today. Obviously, today we're recording this a day early, so this is Thursday. You'll be hearing this on next Monday at the earliest. Why don't we start? Well, actually, you choose, but you can start with either, and then I'll pitch in. I wrote up Ericsson, but Mary wrote up Nokia for us. Where do you want to start? Which company?
Yeah, I mean, Nokia this morning was, I think, headline results were sort of 7%, 8% down sales, and then
sales.
Bottom line up about a fifth, I think, on a comparable basis.
Bottom line,
net profit. Yeah.
Okay, so both companies are doing quite a good job of extracting more profit from less revenue.
They are, which is interesting.
Because they've cut quite a lot of jobs, I guess.
They've cut quite a lot of jobs. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things is their ability to cut jobs at the moment. And I did ask, I did my usual sort of crack of dawn call with Nokia CEO, where a few journalists sort of, I think most of them are probably in Finland, so it's not that bad because it's 8:30. It's 2 hours ahead. But
and you
if you're brave
on
enough to do it in the UK, then you're on it at 6:30.
You're clearly more dedicated to your job than I am.
But it's the only chance that you sort of get to ask him.
No, good for you. No, it's obviously the correct thing to do. I'm not saying my half-assedness is laudable.
And I think there was quite a lot of talk about costs on Ericsson's call on the. So I don't get an opportunity to do a call with the CEO of Ericsson.
Right.
You usually get offered, and I think you did as well. Frederick Yedling, who's head of the networks business.
I chatted to Frederick as well.
Which is always good.
I've got to say, just a little aside, this is the first time I've done a call with him where it was on Teams and we had cameras.
Yeah, I noticed that as well.
And he's on tour doing a business trip somewhere, and he made time to do this.
Black top on in his hotel.
Yeah, I don't know if I actually made a little joke when we're getting to the end of the call. I went, okay, well, I better let you go off and speak to lesser journalists like Ian Morris from Light Reading, and they sort of laughed in that cautious way that they do. But I got to say, I thought Frederick was looking. He was looking in fine fettle. I've met him sometimes before, like at my World Congress. He looks a little bit harried, a bit knackered, whereas he was looking quite fresh and rosy cheeked on this one. So
he did,
he's obviously And maybe it's because he knew that their results were going to be half decent. Anyway, I just thought I'd interrupt there. But what were you saying about your chat with Frederick?
Yeah, so I did that. I mean, I'll probably talk about that a bit later because I was asking him a few specific things. But the call that they do with the equity analysts, which tends to be quite early, I think Nokia's is sort of afternoon, and I never usually bother with it after having done the early morning one. I've usually written things up, but I try and get on Ericsson's, and there's a lot of talk about margins and costs and what's going on there.
Yeah.
And Boya Ekholm, the CEO, sort of giving his perspective on how that's going to develop in the future. But I think it is interesting they both managed to increase gross margins, and as you say, it's taking a lot of jobs out of the business. But the concern's always going to be how much can you do that before you start to hurt your competitiveness?
Yeah, like with R&D and that sort of.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's a
Salesforce.
particular concern for Nokia. Because they kind of did this a few years ago, yeah. They had various issues to do with their 5G product portfolio under previous management. It's all kind of ancient history now, but it really tripped them up at first. It screwed them up for a couple of years, and they lost market share. And some of it, I think, was just to do with cost cutting. You know, if you looked at the R&D commitment, it was going down under Rajiv Suri, the former CEO, and I think I did ask him about it. I did one interview with him before he went, and he was sort of like insisting, you know, they can still realise efficiencies, and it's targeting areas that they don't need to invest in anymore. But it just didn't look very good. And I think one thing you've seen change under Pekka Lundmark is this kind of commitment to try and keep that at least stable, if not increase it each year. So one of the questions I asked on my call with him this morning was, you know, how can you be sure that you can sort of maintain competitiveness when you're cutting costs this much? Because he sort of said himself, I think they've cut, when he did his second quarter update, they cut 6,000 jobs in the past 10 months. That's 7% of the whole headcount. Yeah. And most of it, he said, had been in mobile, because that's the bit that's obviously been struggling for Nokia. Yeah. And if you're cutting heavily in that market, which is, by the way, they're still their biggest business group, even though the sales have come down quite a bit. Yeah. Then you just sort of worry about the impact. And he's very, very sort of no, we're still not cutting R&D. You know, we're able to do this and basically still maintain competitiveness. And I suppose the thing that backs that up, and we were chatting before we came on, you were sort of talking about Ericsson doing a lot better than Nokia in this market. But there's one big difference between the two companies on the mobile side of things really at the moment, and that's North America. Yes. And the reason for that is, if you go back to sort of around about this time last year, a little bit later, kind of December, I think, this bombshell got dropped that Ericsson had landed this huge deal with AT&T worth about 14 billion over several years. And as a consequence of that, AT&T wouldn't be using Nokia anymore. And it's essentially in the past used Nokia across about 1/3 of its sites, and it's used Ericsson across the other 2/3 of its sites. And what this means is it's essentially going to be heavily reliant on Ericsson. They would deny themselves, AT&T would, that they've become reliant on a single vendor, because the whole thing's been presented as a sort of Open RAN project. And
you've written excellent length on how Open RAN it is.
Yeah, I mean, there are some component suppliers in there, obviously, which is more to do with virtual RAN, really, I think. And there's also
and there's lots of talk of compatibility radios and compliance and that sort of thing.
And you've created a situation, you could say, where they have the ability to swap things out more easily in future, potentially, because they're open interfaces. But I'm sort of skeptical about the Open RAN nature of it. It might be Open RAN in name, and it might have, you might be able to do Open RAN with it. I mean, in a sense, it's not that different from one of the big deals that Nokia landed in India recently that we've both written about, I think, with Vodafone Idea, where it wasn't actually written about in the press release. And maybe they thought that if they'd highlighted this point, they'd have been laughed at a bit, given that it's a sort of deal that, on a site basis, it looks very similar to what you do traditionally, in that you're doing everything. But Nokia's providing Open RAN compatible equipment, apparently, with that deal. So
that was the Vodafone Idea deal. I'd forgotten that I'd written it myself.
4G,
September 30th.
Yeah, and anyway, but the AT&T thing, essentially what's happened is Ericsson's picked up this work at Nokia's expense. Nokia's no longer with that operator, essentially, now in a big market, and it accounted for a big share of their mobile revenue. I think they estimate themselves somewhere between 5% and 8%. It's a big chunk of your revenues is AT&T that they've lost.
Yeah, well, I actually asked Frederick about that, and I actually introduced our audience to a bit of cricketing parlance, because I said that he likes to play a solid forward defensive stroke. And I even had a link to a BBC article describing how to play a forward defensive stroke. For like non-English listeners or maybe even some English listeners who don't know that I'm making a reference
Swedish readers
to a cricket shot. But the metaphor is that he'll just sort of give a very sort of quite a neutral, non-committal answer.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I said, how much of all this is down to that one deal, and all he'd do is refer to whatever stuff they'd come out with when it announced. He didn't want to be drawn on comments.
Yeah, well, Boyer got asked about it on the call,
okay.
So I didn't ask Frederick because I'd listened to that, and he said they obviously don't. I think I might have asked Frederick about it. I don't know. I seem to remember him saying we're not going to split it out for you because then it sort of gives a clue of what capex spend is at different telcos.
Yeah, no, I mean it's fair enough, but they wouldn't even. I was like, just give me a steer.
Yeah,
but he wouldn't even do that.
Yeah, I mean, Boyer said on the earnings call, he said it's not just one deal; it's broad based. Now
that could mean anything.
I'm not quite sure how broad based it is because it's a big improvement in North America. It's like, I think if you look at this time last year, third quarter 2023, Ericsson's North American revenues halved.
Yes. Because they're quite volatile. Those American operators, they really go up and down.
They are, and one thing that's happened that seems to be quite unique to North America that we haven't seen in other parts of the world in mobile is this inventory build-up. I'm not quite sure why it would be such a factor in North America and not something that's been talked about as much in other parts of the world. But what seems to have happened...
Maybe that's why they're volatile. Maybe they go on a spending spree and then they just
This is exactly what they did. When we came out of the pandemic and everybody was going on about supply chains being gummed up and... it's one of those expressions people use, isn't it? It's like swinging to a net loss or wiping off billions.
When you lose share price, value. It's always wiped off.
Yeah, supply chains get gummed up.
Yeah, we like journalistic cliches.
Yeah, so supply chains were gummed up after the pandemic, and I think what they did is sort of in anticipation of that, or where they could, they bought lots of stock. They didn't want to be in a situation again where they were struggling to get parts they might need. So they kind of went on a bit of a shopping spree and accumulated a lot of stock that they've essentially just been running down ever since. And obviously that means that in like last year and maybe late 2022, I can't remember when they first started to complain about this inventory correction. Basically, telcos in North America weren't spending money. They were just sort of going to the cupboards and, rather than visiting the shop.
Yeah. And I guess there's always a bit of inventory kicking about. And perhaps under normal circumstances, there'll always be this certain basic background noise level of inventory. And then when things are really tight, they can draw on it, a bit like a strategic reserve.
Yeah.
And just tap into that. But, this was the interesting thing. All the previous quarters when both Nokia and Ericsson have had shitty numbers, they've always gone, to paraphrase them, the fuckers have got to start buying stuff sooner or later.
They've stopped doing that.
I know they've stopped.
Yeah,
and maybe
interesting.
I noted that actually in my piece that they've stopped saying that.
So I think that's a whole discussion point in itself. But maybe before we get onto that,
sure.
The inventory correction I think is over now. I think that's one thing to take is that they are now spending again, and therefore you'd expect that the big improvement. So Ericsson having seen its sales halve this time last year, in the third quarter, in the equivalent period of 2024. They were up 55%, I think, on an organic basis, and I think 51% reported. They're not quite at the level they were in 2022. I mean, Yedling did say this to me. He said, it's quite a low base that we're coming from.
Yeah.
So even though it sounds good to grow your sales 55%, they're still 30% below where they were in 2022 in North America, which is the year when there was quite a lot of spending going on, I think, because of concern about supply chains in the future. And so that's
they'd been a dip during the pandemic.
Yeah, so I think that's one thing to bear in mind is that it's still well below where it was in 2022 spending, and that's despite the fact that there's this big swap out going on. And by the way, him not wanting to comment on it specifically because he doesn't want to break it out for you. The CFO on the call did say that there was a huge amount of activity going on with the AT&T contract in the third quarter, that there was a real ramp up in what they were doing. So he sort of almost gave the game away.
Right.
You know, it's not like he's not downplaying it and saying, "Oh, there's a little bit of activity, but a lot of it's Verizon and T-Mobile as well." He's almost sort of implying most of this is coming from an AT&T recovery. And if you look at, if you jump to Nokia and you look at what they did in North America in mobile specifically, which they do break out, you can sort of see the regional stuff under the different business groups. I think they're down about a fifth. I don't have it up in front of me now.
I've got their presentation. Maybe it's not in that. Maybe it's in just the normal press release.
I think their sales in North America were down about a fifth in mobile, which is obviously still pretty bad. Now, they've lost the AT&T deal, so they're not going to get any work obviously from AT&T. That would account for some of it. And this time last year, they still had that contract, it seems. So that's a really bad comparison for them in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing you've got to remember is they don't serve Verizon anymore. They lost Verizon back in, I think, 2019, 2020. They had this, it was the first of the 5G upsets, really, when, I mean, this is very much due to product competitiveness, which I'm not sure this recent loss is. But that one definitely was, I think.
Is their main gig T-Mobile then?
So their main gig's T-Mobile. They're about 50-50, I think, with Ericsson and T-Mobile. But it suggests that, I mean, it's very hard to tell whether T-Mobile is, and it's not something I have to say that I asked Pekka Lundmark. You know, you only get 10 minutes, and I didn't go, is T-Mobile spending? He probably wouldn't have told me anyway.
Yeah.
When it's a market itself that where they've got several operators, they're more prepared to comment on it. But if it's a market where they only have one customer, they're probably not going to tell you. So it's almost not worth asking. But is T-Mobile spending a lot on equipment? In which case, the two beneficiaries would obviously be Nokia and Ericsson. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to tell, I think, because of these moving parts and this big AT&T loss.
You say it's hard to tell, but if we accept that Nokia is overexposed to T-Mobile in the States, and its general mobile revenues aren't looking great, then doesn't that guide us that maybe T-Mobile isn't spending that much?
Well, it does, but then you're taking this big company out of the picture that was still there this time last year, yeah?
Right.
So AT&T was still doing stuff. I mean, it might not.
I see. So how much you allow for that drop off?
I think it's quite hard. So you'd have to look at various moving parts and try and figure it out. Enough. And I mean, maybe you could. Maybe if I put a spreadsheet together, I could do a bit of a better job on it. But I've quite got a sense of whether. I mean, this is the interesting thing, and this gets to your point about, are we now at the bottom of the curve, and is it going to come back? Because I think North America often gets sort of seen as a bit of a lead. You know, when it happens there, it might kind of happen somewhere else afterwards. And it's also a really
I'd say the two leading markets in the world are North America and Northeast Asia, aren't they? Yeah,
exactly. And the other thing about North America is it's a very profitable market for the telcos. It always, you know, no matter what work they're doing,
ARPU's so much higher.
ARPU's so much higher, so I don't even think it matters what the nature of the work they're doing. It's just seen to be a more profitable market to be in, so it's really important. And that's why, that's one of the reasons, by the way, why Ericsson's profits did very well. You know, we're talking about they've managed to lift margins, and some of it's cost cutting, taking out a lot of jobs, obviously. But this time last year, they were doing a lot of work in India where the margins are shit.
Yeah.
You know, you basically don't make anything, I think I've been told by some analysts. Really? You almost don't make anything at all on some of these projects at first. You're just putting in a lot of equipment and you're doing it at low cost, and
just
it's
hoping to make it back
hardware
on service
installation
or whatever.
I mean, maybe down the line they're thinking on when it becomes more about capacity.
Yeah, because obviously ARPUs, especially compared to America, ARPUs are going to be tiny in India.
And so there's this, they call it a mix shift. The business mix shift, you know, from Asia to North America,
from lots of money to not so much fucking money.
Yeah. So, but if you go the other way to, so if you go from India to where it was all happening last year to North America, and this job with AT&T. Now, even though the AT&T job, I was speculating when I first wrote about this, doesn't sound like it might be a very profitable deal, because if you're shouldering some of the costs to have done this.
Whether it's generous credit terms or whether it's, as you say, just outright shouldering.
I mean that I do know for a fact.
Or
that
just dropping your pants on the price.
Yeah, but the equipment they're taking out, that's Nokia equipment, across a third of sites, there's a lot of sites they're taking, a lot of radios they're taking out, is good equipment.
It wasn't fully amortized or whatever, depreciated.
Yeah, so you're writing that off, and someone's having to bear the cost of that, and it's either going to be AT&T that's bearing the cost of it, or Ericsson or
some combination,
and therefore it didn't seem like it might be a hugely profitable deal.
Yeah.
And I don't have any more insight into whether it is.
No, they're keeping their cards fairly close to their chest on that one.
The fact that their margins have done very well is
just
a good
to quickly
sign.
interrupt on that. Look, I've got Ericsson's table. year ago quarter, gross margin 39.2%. This most recent quarter, 46.3%. So that's 7 percentage points more margin.
Yeah.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah.
And then that percolates all the way down to all the other like EBIT margin, EBITDA. No, not DAR. They don't have a D. And
they've started reporting things slightly differently. I don't know why.
Yeah, well, then you always get these little asterisks that say non-generally accepted accounting principles, and you're like, what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, why, if they're generally accepted, aren't you using them? Anyway, this is an accounting thing. But the other thing, talking about bottom line, a year ago, they had a net loss of 30 million, is this kroner?
30 billion, I think.
Billion kroner, yeah. And then this quarter, they've got a profit of nearly 4.
Yeah, well, the reason for that's to do with impairment charges last year.
Oh, okay.
So you remember the Vonage acquisition?
And they kept writing it down. Yeah,
that was all to do with write-downs on Vonage.
I see.
Yeah.
But then even other margins like, EBIT margin,
That's operating profit, basically.
Okay, nice one. I was about to say I don't really get what the difference is between all these. I mean, that was minus, and again, maybe a lot of this is the Vonage thing, but that swung just like almost 50 percentage points.
Yeah.
And EBITDA margin has swung to a lesser extent. Maybe that's taking out the Vonage thing. But either way, all of those margin things are going in the right direction for Ericsson.
And I think with Ericsson, there's several reasons why the margins have improved as much as they have. One is this business mix shift, obviously. So even if that job that they're doing with AT&T that does involve a lot of hardware replacement they're bearing some costs, it doesn't really seem to be hurting them margin-wise. And I think the fact that you're working in North America, which, as you said, for all these reasons to do with higher ARPU, and they can probably sell their stuff for a higher price. It's just a more profitable market. Everybody accepts that. It's always been seen as the most profitable market to be in, I think. That's one reason. The other reason is job cuts. So they cut 2,000 in the quarter. Net sort of dip in headcount is down 2,000. If you look at where they are now, by the way, since Bowie Ecom took charge, and this is taking into account the fact that there's been a few divestments of media assets and things like some of the TV stuff.
Red Bee,
things like that. I mean, you're familiar with them.
Yeah. Got my mate who works there.
And then they've also bought Vonage, and they've bought a couple of other things as well, like Cradle Point and some small acquisitions. But the net drop in headcount from when Bowie Ecom took charge to now is 15,500 jobs. So it's a massive reduction in in headcount over this period. It's about 14% of the former total, I think, and that's obviously helped to kind of improve the margins. They've obviously been able to do it in a way, back to the point I was talking about with Pekka Lundmark at Nokia, that doesn't hurt your competitiveness. If you look at what they're spending on research and development, Ericsson, do you know how much that's gone up annually since the days of Hans Vestberg?
I don't.
60% increase in spending each year.
Well, they have to. I mean, you probably got more of these data points readily to hand than I do, but I know that Huawei's R&D spend's always just massive.
And I think this is the thing: is this perception? This is one of the things that both Bowie Ecom and Pekka Lundmark have realised is really important: is that you don't want to be seen to be cutting R&D spend, and you can't be cutting R&D spend when you've got this huge competitive.
You're sacrificing the future. If you're
sacrificing the future. The whole reason I think they'd been seen to have sort of lost product competitiveness and fallen behind in the 4G days was that under Vestberg they just slashed.
He got a bit distracted with sort of diversification.
It's the same crap that the two big telcos in the US, AT&T and Verizon. When they started going after things like Time Warner and some of these TV assets.
Someone's probably done it, tallying up the amount of shareholder wedge AT&T has flushed down the bog with these quixotic, ill-fated M&A.
Yeah.
And Verizon sort of did it. It followed suit, but it did it in a much smaller way, and it bought AOL and Yahoo. It thought, I know what will get us back at the table. 90s internet brands.
I know, it's bizarre.
But it was far lesser of an investment than Time Warner was.
So they've got this huge R&D spending increase, despite being able to cut in other areas and still sort of maintain competitiveness. And the R&D spending, they've often made this point that does feed through into margins. It sounds a bit counterintuitive that you're spending a lot more on R&D, that you'd have better profit margins, but it essentially allows you to develop drive out costs of the kit, drive out costs on a scale basis, and then, as you just said, like charge a decent price and have have this sort of low cost that's sold at massive scale equipment.
Yeah,
Not low cost to develop.
Everyone wants to be at the premium end. Everyone wants to be Apple and not Oppo.
Yeah.
You'd much rather be addressing, to extend the smartphone comparison, you'd much rather be addressing the $1,000 average selling price market than the $200 one.
Yeah. And then apparently one of the other reasons why their margins have done well is, which came up in the earnings call, is they have, and Boy Ekin was saying India is now more profitable than it used to be. If we'd done what we're doing in India 10 years ago, what we're doing now 10 years ago, we'd have had trouble on gross margins.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons for that is apparently they used to do things on a more sort of regional basis, like developing kit for specific needs.
And it was very fragmented, the Indian market,
very fragmented,
geographically.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not developing for specific needs, but certainly what they've done now is try to have a global track, he said, for product development.
And then the geezers who own Reliance Jio had a little word with their mates in the government, and suddenly they got a nationwide license.
Yeah.
It's handy, isn't it?
Yeah. So those are the reasons, I think, why the profits have, why you've seen this sort of margin improvement. And a lot of that, I think, is the same story probably at Nokia. You could find a lot of similar reasons in why they've managed to improve their gross margin and their operating margin, even though they've had these big setbacks like the AT&T one particularly. But I think the nice thing about them, just on on mobile, if you buy into what the CEO's saying, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't make this up because it would come back to bite him in the future, but they insist that if you ignore that AT&T deal and you look at what's going on outside it, and obviously you forget about Verizon, which is old history now, that's 2019, that's kind of gone for the time being. He says they've grown mobile market shares up. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been this string of announcements over the last few weeks about Nokia deals. Brazil.
Yeah, we listed a few in our piece today.
I think
so there was obviously
Vietnam,
the Vodafone Idea one.
Yeah. But he reeled off a load of countries where
I'm just going to find it in Mary's report.
But it's I think this this
report.
view,
There we are. India, Japan, Brazil, New Zealand, and Vietnam.
Well, he said so he obviously had them to hand because he came up with them when I asked him the question. But it's now you wonder whose expense is that coming at, that sort of market share gain. I mean, I suspect some of it's to do with Huawei in a few countries, perhaps in a few places. The geopolitics, the unpopularity of Huawei among some governments is compelling operators to switch to Western, to the Nordic vendors instead. I think they've probably made some gains there. He has talked about that in the past as a factor.
I was just clicking through on the story. The Vietnam one's got its own little subplot talking about vendor replacements, because Nokia came out with a thing. I don't know why it's slowly loading up. They came out with an announcement going, "We've just done a deal in Vietnam."
Yeah.
And then quite soon after, Ericsson came out with something. This was September 30th. Mary wrote it for us. And her headline was, "Ericsson puts Nokia in its place with Vietnam 5G announcement."
Yeah.
And the first quote from Ericsson, its press release, is Viettel has strengthened its long-term partnership with Ericsson through the award of the majority of its nationwide 5G RAN deployment. And so there was obviously a bit of jostling for prestige.
Well, I think Nokia did a similar
Vietnam
thing in India, didn't it, where it got most of the Vodafone Idea contract, and I know they feel they've gained some footprint there.
Yeah.
And they have about 55%, I think, somewhere like 55% of the overall work that's been offered.
I don't know about you. I'd definitely be surprised to hear that either Nokia or Ericsson had replaced Huawei in any country that's not under geopolitical pressure to strip out Huawei. I'm not saying Huawei's better, but I don't think they're better than Huawei either. So, and also we know that Huawei somehow manages to offer amazing credit terms and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's not intuitive to me that all things being equal, Huawei would get replaced anyway.
I think there are instances where Huawei's been replaced because the Nordic vendors have gone in quite aggressively on price.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I know the old story used to be that Huawei came along, back in the early 2000s, and a bit later than that even, that the perception was always, they're the low cost guys from China. How do we possibly sort of price stuff at that level? Yeah. I think it's almost gone the other way a little bit sometimes.
Okay. Fair enough.
But I can see, I agree with you. I can see a scenario where operators might want to move away from them just because they anticipate bad news coming down the line in the future. That they've sort of taken a decision to do something about it. And I can also see operators doing it because they're worried that and this sort of gets to one of the reasons that BT, well, not BT specifically, but UK authorities said you have to take out Huawei, was concerned that some of the sanctions that were being imposed on them by the US would have an impact on their products. Basically, you couldn't guarantee things in the same way. You couldn't monitor it in the same way that you used to. You couldn't look at the source code quite as easily and sort of figure out what's going on.
And the chip ban.
Chip ban. I mean, I've talked to people sort of off the record about this who were sort of in the know at companies and on the kind of telco side, and they've, to be honest with you, there's not the people I spoke to said there's not a kind of a big impact that they've seen so far on what they're able to deliver, but they're certainly concerned that there might be.
Did you see, talking about chip bans, you see ASML's results were really down?
Yeah, I know, because they've kind of tightened up what they can do in terms of serving China now, haven't they? And I think they were selling loads of stuff there like last year. So
yeah, and you keep hearing little whispers like in the mainstream financial press, like Bloomberg, whatever, that the Yanks are planning yet another round of stopping their own companies from selling stuff to people they don't like.
The trouble is they're hurting their own companies, and
I mean,
it's the world's biggest market.
I think I've been pretty consistent on this. I don't like this thing. I don't like it when anyone does it, but right now America's doing it the most.
Yeah,
this thing of appropriating your own domiciled private companies as part of a political project.
Yeah, totally.
The two things should be fucking separate.
Yeah. Just on the Nokia Ericsson stuff as well. I mean, the other thing they're obviously two really different companies, because all we've talked about so far is mobile, and that is pretty much all Ericsson is. It's a mobile.
And I think it's fair to say it's outperforming Nokia on mobile at the moment.
And I think a lot of that's to do with, I do think a lot of that's to do with AT&T.
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't think if you look at a lot of other regions, and as I say, if you talk to Pekka Lundmark, he's saying they've grown market share. So I think if you take out the AT&T deal and the fact that they're not with Verizon anymore, they don't have that contract with a really, really, really big company. I don't think that there's a huge difference in terms of the two players on the mobile level. The really big difference between them is that Nokia's got this huge fixed line business, network infrastructure it calls it, which does FTTH, it does optical, it does IP networks, and that is starting to look like it could be a bright spot again in the future. So I think if they do a breakdown of fixed IP, they break it out, IP and optical, and the fixed and the IP stuff was grown at quite a healthy rate, I think, year on year in the third quarter, led by North America, they were saying. They did, interestingly, AT&T, having taken away their RAN work, has given them a big FTTH deal, I think. And they seem to be doing well on the IP stuff as well. The optical was a bit of a surprise to me. That seemed to be down, like maybe, I don't know what the percentage drop was, but they didn't seem to do too well in optical, and they've been talking that up a bit recently ahead of this Infinera takeover they're trying to push through. But it sounds like it should be a growth story. The whole positioning there is maybe it's not about the telco market, maybe it's about serving data center needs and even needs within specific data centers, kind of intra-data center connectivity to do with GPUs, to do with hooking up clusters of GPUs and having products. Yeah,
well, there's a thing actually. A colleague of ours, Ramsey, shared something with me about there being activity on connecting big data centers to each other to create this kind of hive mind kind of thing, which I'm afraid gives me the fucking Terminator heebie-jeebies again.
It does me too, but it's a great area to. I mean, I think that's a really sensible takeover, that Infinera deal.
It's obviously a growth area.
It's a growth
whether
area.
or not it leads to Armageddon's another matter.
Yeah, but for them to try and get into that, I think it's quite a sensible move by Nokia's CEO, and that's a story that Ericsson doesn't have. It doesn't have a fixed line play. Basically, it's not. It's not in that market. So
and Nokia does, thanks to the Alcatel-Lucent.
If we're talking about intra-data center or inter-data center connectivity, to do with AI, and that being like a massive connectivity driver in the next few years, and that's where the money's going to go, then that's a reason to be a lot more optimistic as an investor about Nokia stock than Ericsson stock.
Yeah, I think, and just looking at their numbers, I mean, mobile network's bigger, but only by a bit.
Yeah.
Mobile network's about 40%, and network infrastructure is probably more like late 30s% or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, their mobile, just to go into the specifics, their mobile network business, I think, was down 19% reported and about 17%
Very
organic.
good.
Yeah, and I think Nokia's was.
Can he smash it on the network infrastructure?
Network infrastructure was down 1%. It was down 1%, but it was up 1% organically.
Perfect.
Yeah. So
you're such a pro.
Yeah.
I prostrate myself at your feet.
I did write it this morning.
It's fresh in your mind.
A week ago, so I can't really remember.
Before you'd had your first beer.
I can't really remember Ericsson. If you wanted to compare the mobile bit of Nokia with Ericsson's mobile bit, so ignoring things like Vonage and software, you get a good sort of. I don't quite know what Ericsson did on networks, but it was flattish. I think it might even been. I don't know if it was up, but it was flattish. And as I say, I think the big difference really is to do with North America.
Yeah, it's all North America.
Because if it's North American, if it's AT&T swap out plus maybe Verizon spending some more plus maybe T-Mobile, then two of those opportunities just aren't there anymore for Nokia, and it makes a big difference in such a big market. And I think that's the problem that Nokia's got in that particular area. So one other reason, by the way, for profits that I didn't mention, one of the reasons their net profits have done well is because both of them did a load of IPR stuff. Right. And that's pure profit.
It is.
If you look at Nokia's numbers,
well, Nokia is especially strong.
Most
in
of the
that
profits just come from technologies.
Yeah, Nokia Technologies.
I mean, really, what the margin is, it's something like 70% or something. The operating margin at technologies, it's almost pure
gross
profit.
Margin is 100%.
Yeah,
and operating margin is 68.8.
Yeah.
So, and so they sold 352 million euros of intellectual property related shit, of which profit was 242.
Yeah. And their overall profit was probably not that much more than that.
Well, indeed.
The net profit figure, the reason that's gone up a fifth, it's 22%, I think, net profit up on a comparable basis. I don't know what the figure was, but a lot of that's just accounted for by IPR, basically. And it's similar with Ericsson. They did very, very well out of a big IPR boost, these licensing deals they do for smartphones.
Yeah, you're right. Their overall profit for the period was 358.
Yeah.
Of which 242 of which was the Nokia technology. There's just one other tangent I want to go on specifically the Ericsson and Nokia stuff before we maybe explore other broader tangents
the traffic
within
thing.
that.
Yeah.
The traffic thing.
I thought you were going to talk about the bottoming out.
Yes, well, I'll get to that, but about the only thing that I managed to get Frederick to talk more fully on and not play forward defensive strokes. This is more of a cover drive.
He's getting a 6 on this one.
No, I wouldn't quite say a 6, but a smooth cover drive maybe, or maybe a cut to third man. Anyway, I'll stop
really
labouring
stop
labouring the cricket terminology. If Charlie who listens, you'll be enjoying that, won't you, Charlie? It was the programmable networks thing.
Yeah.
Which is obviously a big part of, as we say, and I don't mean this unkindly, but Frederick tends to echo what Boy has said. They got a lot of message discipline, let's just put it that way. And Boyer went quite big on that. I mean, I think I've got some of his canned quotes.
I think a lot of this is bullshit, personally.
Well, I thought you would, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. But I pretty much anticipated.
I think this is becoming a much abused term, this programmable.
So let me just say a couple of things to steelman their position before you rip it to shreds. So obviously they went on about that joint venture that we've spoken about, that we spoke about at length with James Crawshaw a few pods ago, and then when I was chatting to Frederick about it, one thing he pointed out, and I was being skeptical for the same reasons we both are, which is like show me the money and all that sort of thing. But one thing he wanted to stress, which I thought was a good point, how good a point only time will tell, but he just spoke about how with this programmable networks, this API opportunity, at the very least, it's an opportunity for the sort of knock-on commercial opportunities that are generated by it, for a lot of the revenues from that to remain with the industry. And an interesting comparison there, if you look at 4G, you look at, or let's call it mobile broadband on the whole. Mobile broadband, pretty much all the profit from mobile broadband left the telecoms industry and went to like big internet giants, and apps like Uber.
I don't know if I go along with that completely.
Okay, well, a lot of it then. But the point is, you know,
if you look at
who's making money from Uber, why are they moaning about fair contribution? A hell of a lot of mobile broadband stuff. That's why they talk about over the top apps.
How much is the CSP market worth annually worldwide in terms of what people are spending on it? It's about $1 trillion a year. How much is the SVOD market worth, say, like Netflix?
No idea.
I think it's probably about 100 billion at the moment,
Okay.
150 billion. So it's a much, much bigger market. People are spending a lot more money on being able to get connectivity than they are on downloading and using some of these apps. The problem is that the Netflixes, there's only 3 or 4 of them globally.
Yeah.
Whereas the service provider market is massively fragmented, and it hasn't grown, and they've basically just replaced voice revenue.
So it's
the lack of growth that's the issue.
But there have been new revenues brought about by mobile broadband, and the new revenues. So if it's $1 trillion market now, what was it 20 years ago?
Well, yeah, it's not grow. I don't know. I don't know 20 years ago.
So my point is,
expected to be.
So my point is
that
the industry narrative is that new revenues generated by mobile broadband were mainly taken, and new profits were mainly taken by third parties, not operators. Anyway, that's the core narrative. You can pick holes in it, but that's certainly one I've heard quite a lot. And Frederick's point was,
the only reason I don't like it, by the way, and I'm not disputing the essential that they've come along and managed to make money on top of what the networks are doing, but it almost gives you this. It's the sort of argument that a company complaining about fair contribution would quite like, that they've come along and they're the ones making money out of it. But you can make the same point that those mobile broadband revenues wouldn't be there in the first place unless you had the Ubers of this world, because nobody would see any need to get a mobile broadband service.
Yes. No.
So all that would have happened is their revenues would have gone
on like the fair contribution tangent. I'm largely aligned with you on that one. Yeah. But for the purpose of this narrative that I'm proposing now, one of the reasons why these extra revenue and profit were taken by third parties is because the APIs involved with exploiting mobile broadband are mainly APIs to do with the handsets.
Yeah.
So someone like Uber needs to have access to GPS and location APIs and all that sort of thing. Whereas this lot of APIs are going to be controlled, if Ericsson has its own way, by this joint venture. And so they're the gateways to this. The question about how big the opportunity is remains to be answered. And I know you're sceptical on that. I share your skepticism, at least to some extent. But they're saying is whatever the opportunity is, we're now in a much better position to make sure we get a decent piece of the action compared to the mobile broadband era. That's all.
Yeah, I've got a couple of problems with the programmable thing. Mm-hmm. And I noticed Nokia started to use this word as well now, and I don't know if they've sort of started to use it because Ericsson does, but they do use it in a more specific way. The trouble I have with Ericsson's use of it, for a start, talking about what you're talking about, so applying programmable to this whole APIs thing, essentially what they mean is you can develop applications on top of the network that features of the 5G network are exposed to your applications, and it makes it easier for these app developers to write for a global community because it's standardized as well.
Yeah, it's like one code for one code to rule them all.
One problem I have with it, if they're talking up programmability as they tried to do, I noticed on their earnings call as like one of the reasons why everybody should be excited about them at the moment and why they're doing quite well. That's bullshit. They're not getting anything from programmability at the moment. You look at Vonage revenues, they're down, and this new thing they've just set up with 12 telcos, this joint venture that's viewed as, which by the way, I do see the sense of that. I do go along with the argument that it's this sort of super aggregator that will help to avoid fragmentation. I get that, but it's not even come into existence legally, I don't think, yet, by the way. And Vonage revenues are down. So it's doing nothing at the moment, programmability for them. It's all a future opportunity. There's some pockets where we've seen, and we had James Crawshaw on the other week talking about Brazil and Infobip and 25 million in revenues. It's something, but it's nothing in terms of what the so you look at the estimates of what these API transactions could be worth, and Ekholm threw these out on the earnings call, and he said, by the way, these aren't ours and we don't know at the moment, but these are the third-party ones. The range he gave, which I think James gave, is 10 billion to 30 billion a year. I think a year. I think he's talking about a year. If you're not talking about it on an annual basis and it's over several years, then it's even worse. But that amount of money is nothing to the world telcos.
Well, let's give our colleagues at Omdia a little shout out there.
There's 20, isn't it?
Well, no, it's less.
Is it?
I mean, I don't know if we're talking about the same thing.
So this is the actual money for the APIs themselves. This is payment for the APIs. All
right. Well, okay. So Dario from Omdia did, when I wrote up the opening keynotes at Network X in Paris.
Yeah.
He opened it up and he was, he was determined to just be a bit more chirpy.
Right.
He felt that last year he was a bit downbeat, and all the data points he picked as just how things are going to shit.
Yeah.
So he decided to look on the bright side of life this time, which is fair enough. And my editorial subsequently, I sort of decided to join him in spirit and just look for light on the horizon. But yeah, he goes, here, where's my report? I said, Omdia forecasts total annual global revenues from network APIs hitting about 9 billion by 2029.
Right.
So that's 9 billion in 5 years' time, spread among all the world's operators.
Yeah, well, I don't know if the operators would even see that, because that presumably would be money that goes to the aggregators themselves. That's good money for someone like Vonage. I mean, the way their operators profit from this, as far as I was aware, is nothing to do with that. The way the operators profit is because you open up, by using these APIs to create new service opportunities, that leads to increased use of the network that the operators can monetize. That's the story.
Okay.
That's why you get these
Fair enough.
These predictions coming from. I mean, I don't know, I'd have to ask Dario, but I don't get why the telcos themselves are not going to make money from the API transactions. The idea, I thought, with the telcos is that they make money from higher use of services, and this is why you get these McKinsey predictions that it could be 300 billion.
But I think part of, and I think this is, unless I misunderstood, that's part of Frederick's point, is they are planning to charge for the APIs.
Yeah, but this is the 9 billion, which but who gets that money for so for a start, what we're talking about is peanuts to the operators anyway.
Totally.
You might as well put a few pence in your back pocket and get a bag of crisps at the pub, so it's nothing.
Yeah,
anyway.
too right in this day and age.
And even if they do get it, I don't quite get that. I thought the APIs themselves, the companies that deal with that do the APIs and that take the payments for that, are going to be these aggregators, the likes of Vonage and Infobip and Google and AWS.
Yeah, well, this JV is supposed to be a super aggregator, and half of it is going to be owned by operators.
It is,
so I guess they get a bit of that.
But that's to cost, right? That's not a profit generating venture. That's to cost.
No, you're right. That's a good.
So
point.
The money's supposed to come at the next level up, which is the companies like Vonage that deal with the developers. The developer comes to Vonage, and it makes a payment to Vonage basically for APIs that they want to get use of and that they can develop. And then is Vonage giving some money to telcos from that? I don't know. They did say they were going to do that originally, but it's a bit confusing to me at the moment. And even if they are, it's just peanut. It's nothing. It's not worth anything. It's not going to change anything at all. That spread over the world.
Well, I think it remains, and I'm going to start to wrap it up here, just because we've done this for a while. We do want to chat about some other stuff. But the
I was going to say why programmable is a shit word as well. Otherwise,
go on, do that.
So the other problem I've got with Ericsson's use of the word programmable is that it's so vague the way they've started to use it. So I get if you use the word to mean this API stuff and you're applying it strictly to that, great. They've started doing things like calling this AT&T network they're building, the Open RAN, the thing we've just been talking about, their big deal with AT&T. That's a programmable network.
Yeah.
Okay. That's got nothing to do with the API stuff.
Right.
Now, AT&T is a member of this joint venture they've just formed, and it's very interested in APIs, and it's involved there in all sorts of things. But that's a separate thing from the Open RAN they're building for AT&T.
So you're saying programables are far too vague.
It's become a vague catch-all for this sort of overarching network philosophy they have that doesn't really mean anything. And there's nothing, by the way, there's nothing very different about this network that Ericsson's building for AT&T other than it includes Open RAN interfaces.
Yeah.
It's not even, by the way, a cloud or virtual RAN, most of it. There's a huge amount of purpose-built equipment in that. It's not even a vRAN in the way that, I mean, some of it will be, but at the moment, from what I've been told, it's mainly purpose-built. So it's not even, I mean, you can make an argument for VRAM being more programmable, because if you separate hardware and software, you get this idea that you can keep the same. I mean, this is what I was talking to Frederick about a little bit to do with 6G, but you can keep the same hardware in place maybe and change your software vendor that runs on that in the future, or update it in a way that's more, that's easier, that's more agile, and then it becomes kind of programmable. You're sort of rewriting the chip essentially, yeah?
Yeah.
But this is purpose-built, a lot of it. So the only bit that's programmable that you get from using these Open RAN interfaces is this layer called service management orchestration that includes this thing called the RIC.
Yep.
And that's about putting apps on the network that will do things like power down base stations when then a neighborhood's gone silent at night. That's just, I'm sorry, but that's just not exciting at all. That's efficiency of network management. That's not something that's going to change again, it's not going to move the needle for the telco business. And no one's been able to explain to me how any of those RIC apps that get talked about, by the way, all of the examples that always get given is powering down base stations during quiet periods. Yeah. It's always energy efficiency. No one's been able to provide an example of one that would actually generate revenues for telcos.
No, I agree. And, ultimately, just to draw a line under that thing, we're still, the underlying narrative is still, we're creating a platform for future innovation. We don't know what the fuck that future innovation is going to look like or if it's going to happen at all. But this is what we're betting on anyway, which obviously is a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to believe in. But then, I just want to quickly touch on the editorial I wrote at the end of last week after I got back from Network X, and I just said the telecoms recession may be bottoming out. And this was partly inspired by Dario's angle on his opening keynote, and partly just inspired by basically, you got to look hard for it. But if you look hard for it, if you imagine that telecoms we tend to think of on a sort of 10-year cycle, mobile anyway. And so if you're looking at a curve and you're trying to work out whether you're at the bottom of a curve, whatever metrics we're talking about, it could be revenue growth or whatever. And I'm just saying maybe, and it's hard to tell when you're in the middle of the bottom, it's hard to tell because things are more or less flat.
Yeah.
But, two things you can look for are things getting worse more slowly than they were before, which is kind of Dario's point. He said things aren't great, but I think one of his slides that I've got in my photo that I took of him, it says revenues from connectivity are growing again, and he's saying that compared to a previous period where they were shrinking. And so there's a slight inflection point there.
Why does he think revenues are growing? Is that just because to me the only
he's got a number. It's not just anecdotal. He's got some numbers. He said, I'm trying to read my own photo.
I mean, this is probably, we're talking about inflation-linked price rises, aren't we, with this sort of stuff? That's what we're talking about.
It's funny you mentioned inflation because that came up on stage.
Right.
And
I imagine that's all that is.
Well, and that's the biggest thing that obviously bursts the bubble of that narrative.
Yeah.
Is like revenues are growing about 1% a year and inflation has recently been as high as 10% a year.
Yeah.
So that's an issue. Anyway, I'm not presenting this for you to pick holes in it now. I'm just presenting it just to explain why it's possible, if you're being optimistic and you look hard enough, to imagine that maybe we're at the bottom of the curve. But how long it's going to take, as you say, the Deloro forecasts aren't great. I think Nokia adjusted down some of its forecasts for mobile again today. So that doesn't mean that, when people talk about recessions, they talk about like U-shaped and V-shaped and W-shaped and all that kind of shit. There's no way this is going to be a V-shaped thing. If this is a recovery, it'll be a U with a very long base.
Yeah.
But maybe we're near the middle of that base, and maybe over the next few years things are going to pick up. I mean, I agree. In fact, this is a segue for you to talk, ideally not for too long because we've got other topics we want to talk, but your 6G angle. Yeah. Because obviously, typically on the mobile 10-year cycle, we expect a sort of sine wave where the peak of the sine wave is around about the introduction of a new generation of technology, and then the trough is sort of in the mid cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then it peaks again. So we'll have a peak every 10 years and a trough every 10 years, typically. But I don't think that's the case anymore. And one of the reasons I'll cede the floor to you here is because there just isn't going to be an investment cycle with 6G that makes that happen.
I think that's the problem, and I think this bottoming out, and I go along with it to some extent. I think there's been big drop-offs.
I mean, it's optimistic and speculative, mate. I wouldn't bet my life on it.
To be honest with you, I don't think it's that optimistic. If things go down and then stop going down, and they just stay there.
Yeah, that's something.
It's worse than them going down further. But there's got to be there's a floor. Yeah.
Yes.
There's obviously a point when they
don't hit the floor.
When they can't go down anymore anyway. You know, you reach a point when you've always got to spend a bit on your network each year
to maintain it.
Maintain it. You know, you don't want to be like Thames Water, which spends a bit on its network each year, but it's all a bit crap and
ends up pumping loads of stuff into Lake Windermere.
Right.
That wouldn't have been Thames Water. I just saw that in the news when I was coming over.
But we were chatting earlier about how they don't talk about traffic anymore. You know, there was this period last year when they went, at some point,
it's all about
they're going to have to spend again.
And then we've spoken about William Webb and the S-curve and all that.
Yeah, and I think maybe because people like us and William, well, for a start, it's not a very positive message to be putting out in your earnings reports. I don't think that customers are going to read saying at some point, you guys, you know, you're going to have to spend, aren't you? Because you won't have any choice.
You run out of inventory. You're tight.
You're going to run out of inventory. You've got all this tidal wave of traffic bearing down on you. Unless you reinforce your networks, you're going to be fucked. That's not really something you should probably be telling your customers. I don't think.
It's not inspiring.
You're not going to make any more money, but you're going to have to spend a load of money. That's basically what they're saying. Water. Yeah. So I think that's one reason they've stopped saying it. And I think the other reason they've stopped saying it, which is more William Webb's point, is that they might not want to admit it as much. And there's still some of these reports flying around. There's one that came out from the CTIA going, it's the most we've ever seen in a year, this traffic increase. I think a lot of that was to do with FWA, by the way, which is actually another reason I think why just to mention it, why Verizon and T-Mobile and people like this might be spending some money.
Yeah.
Because FWA is a bigger deal in the US than it is anywhere else.
It is, yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what I've heard.
If that was something
and it makes
Frederick
sense,
said,
really, because it's such a large country.
Yeah, why would they be spending when nobody else is? I asked him that, and he said, well, some of it might be to do with FWA.
Which is fixed wireless
access.
That's people listening who don't know.
He didn't say that exactly, but I think the problem with this this traffic stuff is that they might be recognising that this traffic curve, this growth, this S curve that William's going on about is a reality. You know that yes, it is slowing down, and unfortunately, they've just done their networks are just too good, aren't they? You know, it's like It's like when you buy a pair of jeans, ideally, the guys at Levi and Wrangler want them to wear out in a year.
Yeah.
So another
if they make them too good, you never fucking buy anymore.
You know, you wear leather clothes that'll last you the rest of your life. That's not very good for the clothes maker. And maybe they just made these 5G networks and these fiber networks seem to be coping quite well with capacity growth. And I think the problem is, and this gets onto the 6G thing, is that if people are only spending money to fortify their networks, and then the networks are actually doing quite well, and they don't really need to put in as much new equipment as we wanted them to, perhaps, if we're speaking from the vendor perspective, then there's no growth opportunity there. We might see a point when, because if you look at the forecasts that people like Analysys Mason are coming out with, and I think maybe Deloro now, and you look at what the operators are issuing in terms of guidance on capital intensity, Alison Kirby at BT, we've reached peak capex. You know, this sort of message. She envisages a point in 2029, I think 2030, when they're really low on capital intensity.
Yeah.
You know, they just because this is the other problem I have with the programmable networks argument as well, by the way, because the whole reason Ericsson's really in this is nothing to do with APIs. It couldn't give a shit about APIs. What it really wants is for all these services to generate so much extra traffic that operators go off and spend a load of money on new equipment.
Yeah.
And if generating all this extra traffic, because the networks are actually still doing pretty well and we don't really need to invest in the way that we did, means the capital intensity profile in future is much lower than it used to be. It just doesn't really work. So there's no guarantee that people...
If I understand what you're saying, to like whittle it down to words of one syllable, the sort of relationship between traffic and capex is being decoupled.
I'm not sure it has completely, but it has more so.
They're drifting apart.
The problem is that if networks are doing, there's this assumption that if the operators are making lots of money, they'll spend more money with us. That's one thing that you hear. It's one of the justifications for this API stuff.
Yeah.
If they make more money themselves through APIs, which I'm very skeptical they will,
as we've covered.
but if let's say they do, let's buy into that story. They make loads of money from these new API services. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to spend
go to shareholders.
They might send it to shareholders. They might invest it in some other area.
Idiotic M&A. It could go to all sorts of things.
If they've got a fibre network there that's very resilient and they don't need to upgrade to this new 25G PON, 50G PON stuff, it's doing very well, thank you very much. And they've got a good 5G network in place and they don't see the need to upgrade to 6G. Why would they necessarily do it? They're not just going to spend because we need to keep spending.
Was that the 6G?
No, the 6G thing was related to that, but the 6G thing I think was to do with this push, and Ecom sort of alluded to this sort of softwareization of networks.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen these NGMN's the Next Generation Mobile Networks Alliance, which is basically a lot of the world's big operators. It's not all of them, but it's people like BT and Orange and NTT Docomo and some others. I think Deutsche Telekom's in there. It's their kind of tech group, really. It's the CTOs of those telcos sit in NGMN Alliance, and they have that club because they want to have a say on how standards should shape up. They don't want to feel that it's all being driven by vendors. So it's their kind of opportunity to say, it's almost a list of demands in a way. And they came out with this position paper this time last year, and they went, and it was to do with 6G. This is what we want of 6G. And the two messages that I took away from it were, we don't want a big hardware swap out when 6G comes along, because we've done that with 5G. And guess what? We haven't made any more money, and it costs us a load of money
to
do
that
it.
Shit.
So we don't want to do that again. What we really want is for this stuff to be software upgradable. So like leave the same hardware in place basically and make changes through software, do that sort of thing.
So that's one thing I was wondering about. Sorry to butt in, but when I was just talking about the decoupling of network traffic and CapEx.
Yeah.
Presumably there is some obsolescence, even if it's only because R&D comes up with better versions. That means that even if it's software upgradable, and let's say, for the sake of argument, 6G was entirely a software upgradable event.
Yeah.
And you could go from 5G. I mean, obviously, we've argued the toss, and we will again. We're going to get William on again soon because he's just knocked out another book, and this time it's on 6G,
I know.
isn't it?
Yeah, I saw that.
And so there are other disputes as to whether 6G is even a useful concept or term. But let's stick with it for now because it's convenient. And let's say 6G is entirely a software upgradable thing. There's still presumably some advantage to having brand new kit than 10-year-old kit, even if you can make the 10-year-old kit 6G compatible.
Yeah, so I was asking Frederick about this, Frederick Yedling at Ericsson, and he was saying one thing that might be different with 6G is that we have to have he didn't use the word agnosticism, but that's essentially what he was saying. We have to make the hardware kind of more agnostic so that you can introduce it. It's this idea of virtualization, basically, because I was asking him a little bit about NVIDIA. You'll notice that they did this big announcement with NVIDIA a few weeks ago.
Yeah, rings a vague bell.
Where Ericsson and Nokia and T-Mobile and NVIDIA all sort of talked about opportunities to use NVIDIA in the radio access network. And the big NVIDIA pitch is that what you do is you buy its GPUs and you put them in your radio access network, and you can use them for AI applications, either for network efficiency or even better, something to do with edge computing that might lead to new revenues. But you can also have them double up for RAN software, essentially. So there's stuff that at the moment that's running on dedicated chips, ASICs that Ericsson and Nokia do, or that's virtualized to run on general purpose processors from Intel. You'd do that on NVIDIA's GPUs, and they double up for sort of AI applications as well. And I think this is what Frederick was getting at to some extent with this idea of 6G being more sort of software based and less hardware based, is that their RAN stack in the future, ideally, if it really is virtualized and if it lives up to that description, is something that you can move around different hardware platforms. It doesn't just go on Intel's chips. You could put it on AMD stuff as well. You could put it on NVIDIA.
So everything becomes general purpose.
Everything. Yeah, exactly. You have now. I don't personally think at the moment this is that realistic, because everybody that I talk to, and I've written about this loads in the past, it's quite hard, especially when you get down to this sort of layer one, very resource hungry stuff in the RAN. It's very hard to to do that efficiently on general purpose silicon. It's very hard to do it without any kind of accelerators involved, where you introducing more kind of customized stuff. And it's also hard actually just to move from a general purpose processor that's x86 based, which is the architecture that Intel and AMD are using, to one that's ARM based. And it will be very hard to move stuff to presumably to NVIDIA's platform, which is
different
called
instruction set.
CUDA. I did write what it actually stood for, but that's an architecture as well. So you've got these different options there, these different hardware options. It's quite hard to, but this is what he's saying that it's a kind of issue they're trying to tackle, I guess, is to have people might not buy into the fact that they're trying to tackle it. There might be suspicion, amongst Ericsson's critics, that they really want to do this because it's better in a way for them to have, you could argue, to have the way they've always operated and the way they're set up culturally is to have a business that sells purpose-built products where they're selling a lot of hardware and software.
Well, we've always said the whole Open RAN concept is antagonistic to the business model of the big kit.
This is more cloud RAN, virtual RAN, really. Right. But it's if you view it as a
the broader concept of things being more general purpose, more interchangeable, less bespoke, as you say, less closed and locked in. All of that is antagonistic to the legacy business model.
It is.
Of these.
But this is. But I guess if the operators are pushing for it that hard, if they're saying this is what we want,
then they've got to at least pretend to be into it.
They've got to at least pretend to be into it, and maybe you don't want to be like the Kodak guys, that don't move when something's coming along. So
even though they had loads of digital photography IP, they just sat on it.
Totally. So even though it's really early days for this at the moment, I kind of see what he's saying. I mean, this is what he's sort of saying, is that we need to look at this option of having a stack that you can put on any hardware platform, basically. And that's what he was saying 6G might be, is this kind of idea that you can take software and put it on something. And this is one of the reasons when I spoke with Telus, which is one of the Canadian operators, about their Open RAN stuff they're doing with Samsung, and that's on an Intel processor. One of the things he said, it's Bernard Bureau, I think, is like the Open RAN guy, I think he's CTO, but he's certainly in that team. He was saying we're really happy with Samsung, but in the future, what we might want to do is change to another vendor, but not take out the hardware, not take out Intel's service. They stay there, and then we can introduce a new baseband vendor on top of it, and we don't replace all the hardware. And that's this idea
Obviously, that's a more efficient way of doing things.
That's the more efficient way of doing things. And that's this idea that any software can go with any kind of mass-produced sort of chip, I guess.
And that probably is the way, ultimately, as a megatrend, things are headed.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be very, very hard to realise, but that's...
Yeah, and you've written some excellent stuff about Open RAN. I always take the piss out of you for being obsessed with Open RAN. Yeah. But you've written some excellent stuff on that, which examines the pros and cons of this whole concept.
And so to link it back to what Ekern was saying in the earnings call, because he got asked about margins and revenue over a long time horizon. I think one of the equity analysts was saying, how should we think about you sort of years into the future? And he was commenting on this topic of softwareization, which has actually been a really big trend in the industry anyway, I think, for years, to do with things like NFV and SDN. And
totally. And virtualization on the whole has been a mega trend for about the last 20 plus years.
And he was basically saying it's quite hard to say at the moment, but there's what we need to do is look at, it's a good opportunity for us to boost gross margins. So getting to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, about how they've done a really good job on making that more profitable, but there might be some pain on the top line. There could be smaller but more profitable businesses in future, basically.
Yeah, which seems likely.
And I think this really ties in with what William's saying with his traffic growth stuff.
Yeah.
We had him on a podcast, I think, a few months ago, where he was saying these companies are going to be not as big in future. They won't sell as much equipment,
That's it.
but they can still be...
And for their shareholders, if they're still making the same profit from a smaller revenue base, then what's not to like?
Yeah.
I'm going to move it on. I've got a quick little tangent. I've got the Google Finance pages open for Nokia and Ericsson. And in the last week, Nokia's down, share price is down 4%.
Right.
Ericsson's is up 13%.
13, wow, okay.
Yeah. And obviously the big inflection point was when they announced their quarterlies. So just, I mean, I find those a little odd, really. I don't see why... I mean, the share price movements are a really hard thing to fathom, but I don't think those movements will tell you anything about where those two companies could be 2 or 3 years from now. So I'm going to bring up the other thing, which I think is more important than any of this, is when you go onto Google Finance and you scroll down, and it goes top news, The top news on both of those are your fucking stories.
Oh,
yeah.
There you are.
And none of my stories. So we need to sort our goddamn SEO out, or maybe just write better stories. I mean, SEO is just the other side of that page of just do your fucking job. But yes, both you'll be gratified to hear that both the first news items on Google Finance on both of their share pages are your coverage of the quarterly. So well done, mate.
Oh, good.
And then the one next to you on Ericsson is tradingview.com. Why Ericsson shares are trading higher by about 9%. So let's see so this is like no, I've got to log in to read it. Fuck you, TradingView. I can't be bothered. But yeah, there are reasons.
I mean, TradingViews is, to be honest with you. I'm not sure I know them, but
no. Well,
they're obviously an investor platform.
They got decent SEO. They're ahead of Reuters. Reuters is third. You're first. They're second. Reuters third. That's on the Ericsson one. On Nokia one, you're first. Yahoo Finance second. Times of India third, which is a bit bizarre. That's the Vodafone Idea thing from 3 weeks ago.
Right.
That's odd, isn't it?
But sometimes these things get recirculated in an odd way.
That's odd. I mean, yours on this says 3 hours ago, which is accurate. Yahoo Finance is 1 hour ago. Times of India 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So, and then the fourth one is how to geek the 10 greatest Nokia Symbian phones in history.
Brilliant.
Just random.
That's the best.
The stuff that Google comes up with.
Something to do with Symbian.
Yeah. Well done, Google. You really got your finger on a fucking pulse there. But well done on that. And yeah, I mean, look, we all know the reason share prices fluctuate is because they're a bet on the future.
Yeah.
And Ericsson's numbers were better than people have been betting on, and
this is
Nokia's
what it is,
slightly worse.
It's like some equity analysts have their expectations, and then you miss it, and you go down, and if you beat it, you go up. It can be things like that, and it's very odd. But I think both companies are up since the start of the year, though, aren't they? If you look at year to date,
let's do it. Seeing as
they're both up quite a bit, I think.
Year to date, Nokia's up 22%.
Yep.
Year to date, Ericsson up 37%.
Yeah, I mean, it's not what I would expect at the moment, and I don't quite get what's driving that. But maybe people are just buying into your thing, Scott, that the worst's over, and we can sort of count on.
Well, I think in the podcast we did from the show, as well as Teresa, we had Gabriel Brown from Heavy Reading, and he made a point, slightly tongue in cheek, of like manifesting the upturn. Be the change you want to see, or something like that. These sort of slightly airy-fairy aspirational things. But, we do know that a lot of economics is down to sentiment. It's down to irrational stuff.
Yeah.
And, there's the famous irrational consumer. We don't make decisions on a wholly rational, like Mr. Spock sort of basis.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the biggest inflection point, just to round that one off, and then I'll get onto the final topic. I think we're going to have to skip your 3 Vodafone one just because it's a bit in the weeds and we're running out of time.
I'd struggle anyway, I think.
Okay, no worries.
Complicated.
Is, sentiment. You can just get a shift in sentiment, and it's, the fascinating thing about markets, and I think we've spoken about this on the pod before, the reason markets are best versus top-down central control, in fact, this kind of slightly leads into my final segment, is distributed knowledge and intelligence and decision making. You've basically got markets. The global markets are 1 billion different decisions being made, and you view them in aggregate. Surely they point to the correct position for current markets to be in, rather than some top-down communist style. We've just sat in the Politburo and we've decided that bread should cost £1 today.
Yeah, that's what the CMA wants to do, isn't it, with the Vodafone 3 thing?
Well, there's a bit of that. Yeah, there's a bit of that. And so yes, and I guess you could say that share price is distributed intelligence as well, although it's based on speculation as much as actual facts on the ground. But yeah, that'll move on to the final segment that I want to talk about. Is a story I wrote yesterday, and the headline is "Laws seeking to ban phones in school are misguided." So I went for one of those opinion headlines. I don't do them that often. They're certainly better than question mark headlines, which I detest.
Yeah, I don't think I've used a question mark in a headline for a long time, because someone told me off once for doing it. Some old editor years ago.
It's not good. I bet Ray doesn't do it.
No, I've never seen Ray use one at all.
Well, because it's a cop-out.
Yeah.
Rather than, the cop-out version of this headline I wrote would be, "Are laws seeking to ban phones in school misguided?" Question mark.
Yeah.
And that's me posing the question but sitting on the fence. And I think, as a journalist of all people, we chat to our analyst friends about this, and one of the reasons we can be more strident and outspoken is I think the costs of calling it wrong are less for us, partly because the cadence, we're writing on a daily basis, whereas if they spend a month on a report and it turns out to be full of shit, it'll take them a little while to sort of brush that off.
Yeah.
Whereas we can write something today and it turns out to be bollocks tomorrow. We can write another story going, that turned out to be bollocks. This is what's going on. And it's they used to say newspapers are tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper.
Yeah.
So we've got that ephemeral, very brief window where what we say has any relevance at all. So I think that's another reason not to sit on the fence. Just fucking lead with your chin. What's the worst that can happen? You made a call, you got it wrong. You're only human. And so I think basically there's this a new MP. There's a ton of new MPs because Labour won so many seats in the last. This is the UK I'm talking about here.
Even though hardly anybody voted for them.
Yeah, I know. There was a weird sort of anomaly of first past the post happened.
I think it's the weirdest one ever, isn't it?
I think it is in terms of the
disconnect between seats and
that's
votes.
the word I was looking for. Yeah. Anyway, he's called Josh McAllister. He used to be a teacher. He's done some stuff in the sort of charity sector. He's probably a great bloke, but he's decided he's come up with a new bill, and they call it, I think, a private member's bill, which is when a non-cabinet minister, just a normal rank and file MP, just comes up with something, and they have a day where they all come out with this stuff, and it could be whatever, it could be the most random shit. It could be like pork barrel stuff where a constituent has bribed them to come up. I'm not suggesting they're all bribed, but let's face it, they have influences where they bribe them to say, we need to mandate crab sticks in school dinners or whatever. It could be anything. And this bloke's come up with something, and he's calling it the Safer Phones Bill, which is rather annoying because it's a new URL he's come up with. And our
Safer Phones Bill.
Yeah. And our fucking, we've got, when you're using a work computer, we've got all these layers of security to stop us going onto dodgy websites. And I'm not talking about what you're probably thinking. I'm just thinking more like cyber criminals and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I got this one. It's still not letting me do it. So his URL is called saferphonesbill.co.uk. And I'm getting a message saying, you're not allowed to go there because it's newly registered. So that's one of the filters, newly registered. And you can see why newly registered, I think, is dodgy because I'm sure baddies. But anyway, this one's legit because it's a fucking MP's one. But he calls it Safer Phones Bill. But when you go onto the parliamentary record, it's called Protection of Children, brackets, Digital Safety and Data Protection, close brackets. And he describes it as a bill to provide greater protection for the rights and best interests of children engaging with digital services, in particular through the use of smartphones and other internet-enabled portable devices. Anyway, and he's basically got four things that he wants in this bill. One, I think, is quite reasonable. The first one is just he calls it raising the age of internet adulthood from 13 to 16. And by that, he means the age at which you can have unsupervised permission to allow people to use your data and just generally let you become an adult digital participant. And I think if it's currently 13, that probably is a bit too young. How old's your younger one?
14.
Yeah. So I'll let you be the judge of how informed the decision he can make to let people use his data when he's dicking about on the internet. So I don't think personally it's unreasonable to raise that age to 16. I think that's the best part of his bill. And then he's got another bit which is just a waste of time. The fourth bit, he just goes, committing the government to review further regulation if needed of the design, supply, and marketing and use of mobile phones by children under 16. Committing the government to review further regulation if needed. I mean, that's just pointless. It's redundant. It's just baked in. Anyway, so that's 2 points. Before you rebut, I'll tell you all four of his things. And then he's got one, strengthening Ofcom's powers to protect children from apps that are designed to be addictive. I think that's redundant because Ofcom has already got tons of powers, as I've bitched about on this pod loads of times, the online safety bill and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They're only just fitting into those new clothes. Let's not start lobbying for them to have even more power yet before that plays out. And then the fourth one, which is the most contentious part, which is what my piece was about, and then before delivering my rebuttal, I'll invite you to comment on it. it says, this is quoting, delivering smartphone-free schools by backing head teachers with a legal requirement that all schools should be mobile-free zones. This would be done by putting existing guidance on a statutory footing. And that's the bit that fucking winds me up. But what do you think about any of those, but especially the last one?
The school stuff is... I don't think they should... It's not something the government should be weighing into, really. Your teachers are there to say, don't use your phone in class, in the same way that they're there to say, don't read a porno mag, or spend all your time staring at the bottom of a packet of M&Ms, or
or chatting to your mates, or lobbing stuff around, or just the normal classroom stuff.
And a lot of the other stuff, I just think is, look, mobile phones, kids get their information and these days from that device, whereas in the past they might have got it somewhere else, and that's the parents' responsibility to be looking after that. To me, it's not something that the government should be getting. I'm always a bit suspicious when words like safety get thrown around. Isn't that what what was it in the French Revolution? They called it the Committee for Public Safety. That was the one that guillotined about 250,000 people, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like,
well, I mean, this is you've read my book. I've got a whole group in my book that's name is Safety, Not Freedom, which is a satire of a very authoritarian group called Hope Not Hate. But you set up that's always, whenever people are authoritarian, they always do it in the name of safety. And I actually got a bit, my most ranty part of this, where I have a go at that last bit, is I say, I'll read myself to the audience. I write, it's typical of the weaselly language used by authoritarians who seek to restrict freedoms in the name of safety, per your point just now, that McAllister speaks of, quote, backing head teachers with a legal requirement. So that backing I find especially duplicitous and sinister. And then I say, is this something teachers have requested? And then my other question is, what happens to head teachers who decline this backing? So he's positioning it as a backing, but it's not backing. Because firstly, if they haven't asked for it, what's the provenance of it?
Yeah.
And secondly, what if they say, no, we're really chilled out teachers and we want to let kids have it, but now it's law that they can't do it. So then the head teachers presumably get in trouble. So, this is where I ultimately make the point later on in a more of a sort of summarising section of the piece. I say the law is a blunt instrument that should only be used when more discreet, bespoke attempts at social persuasion have been proven to be inadequate, and even then only in the prevention of substantial threats to the population. So the point of that is, I'm not a big fan, libertarian that I am, I'm not a big fan of governments trying to control our behaviour at all. But obviously we have to have laws. There has to be a law against murder, there has to be laws against various things, but that very explicitly harm other people.
Yeah.
The problem you get with people who want to enlarge the government and create new laws, or perhaps in the case of this guy, just make a name for himself because he's new to Parliament, and maybe I believe him because he used to be a teacher. This is probably a subject close to his heart as well. I think he's sincere, but law is often not the best way of dealing with it. And the funny thing is, the Press Association, where I've just noticed from researching this, their stories just get copied and pasted to 100 different regional publications. Like I saw it in the Shropshire Star and the Hammond High and all that sort of thing. But they
just sort of syndicated.
Exactly.
Material.
Yeah. That's the PA.
Yeah.
They managed to get some comment from the Prime Minister's official spokesman, not a named person, but their official spokesperson. And the quote from them is, head teachers already have the power to ban phones in school, and many have chosen to exercise this right.
Yeah.
So we don't have plans to legislate in that particular area.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and then I said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
So this is a sort of proposal at the moment.
Yeah, it's a bill that he's putting before Parliament, which probably isn't going to go through. So it's a bit of a storm in a teacup, but I still think it's an interesting conversation topic, not just in the subject of phones, but in the subject of, what is the boundary at which the government should just butt out and let people take care of their own business.
But they love doing this. Labour governments, they're all into this sort of.
I mean, the Tories weren't much better, to be honest.
They weren't the last few years of the Tories being. I mean, I think a lot of this actually came during COVID. This sort of sense of state intervention and looking after you, and
they loved it.
looking
And
after you, meaning
you can only have a pint if you have a goddamn
you
Scotch
can only
egg.
do this, otherwise you're going to get told off. And you go for a walk with your friend in the countryside with a cup of coffee, and then some police officers parked out in the parking lot having a go at you when you get back.
Yeah,
and all
yeah.
this kind of stuff.
Or
It's all very
drone filming people walking their dogs in the middle of
in
nowhere.
the Peak District, with another person.
And you know
5 miles away.
the guy
It's
who
just-
sold the whole "you can only have a pint if you have a Scotch egg."
Yeah.
He's fucking editor of the Spectator now.
Is he?
Michael Gove is editor of the Spectator.
Yes, of course he is. That's a bit scary. That puts me off wanting to ever read the Spectator again.
It does a bit. I've seen him on video, and he's definitely wearing a different persona now that because actually he was a journalist back in the day. I didn't know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So he's kind of reverting back after a long sojourn into frontline politics.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm uneasy about it.
Well, they've had Boris Johnson obviously before as a Spectator editor.
Well, indeed.
They? So they've got a track record.
Gove and Bojo got similar trajectory of
I think
oscillating
it's been
back
better
and
in the
forward.
last few years without having.
Well, Fraser Nelson's been brilliant.
He's been really good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's he doing?
I think he's just hanging around. He's going to do a bit of editor at large type of stuff. But he's been doing it 15 years. The superficial thing was that he was quite happy to
I love that
call it a day.
expression, editor at large. It just sort of means you can
Do what the fuck you want, and then every now and then just post some copy and go, "I've written written some sort of shoot from the hip copy."
I mean, I think this to me, the mobile stuff just sort of ties in with, like you were saying, like the last few years of the last couple of years, and maybe the last year in particular of the last Conservative government. There was a lot of this stuff about government intervention into the digital space, and how to keep an eye on people and what they're doing in terms of internet use and this sort of thing, and how to safeguard.
Safety
spaces,
And the thing that really bothers me, and hopefully we're going to get a guy from Ofcom on in coming weeks where we'll thrash this stuff out.
Yeah.
But I actually met him previously after the pub we did with Mary Clark, and he came out to the pub and chatted to us, and and he'd read my stuff and he pushed back, and he can see that I'm often a bit bitchy about Ofcom, as I am nearly all state institutions. And he made some really good coherent points in return. But the one that I said, which I think still remains with the online safety bill, is a lot of the things they tried to make unique to the online safety bill were already illegal.
Yeah.
There's stuff to do, stuff to do with protecting children. I won't even detail it, but we can all imagine the sort of thing I'm talking about that's already fucking illegal.
Yeah.
Quite rightly so.
Yeah.
So my concern is when they start banging on about children in a way, in areas where children are already well protected, and maybe they could be better protected. They're certainly not perfectly protected. Loads of kids get exploited and all that sort of thing, or misled or whatever.
Yeah.
But I just worry that they use it as a sort of Trojan horse, as a thin end of the wedge, to bring in broader constraints that affect everyone.
This is like a problem generally, I think. You get this sort of legislative creep, where they feel there's a need for a new bit of legislation. It's like, to be honest, I think some of this, like early net neutrality legislation, was, I one criticism of it was that it was this idea that Comcast, back in the days when Vonage, which is now a bit of Ericsson, was an IP and a voice over IP internet telephony company, that Comcast can come along and block Vonage on its network.
Right.
Someone said to me, you don't need net neutrality legislation to deal with that. You could just prosecute it under normal competition.
Normal competition, yeah.
But there's a feeling you need to get, I mean...
Well, net neutrality in the States, like so many things, has become this polarised, politicized
I might regret
thing.
using this as an example, and I'm going to ask Pierre maybe to edit out. But this upskirting laws, for instance, which obviously that's an awful thing for anybody to be doing.
People using their phones to stick it under.
Do you need a specific law to deal with that? Couldn't you just deal with something like that on the grounds of it being a form of sexual harassment or abuse?
Quite.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a delicate subject. I don't think we should edit it out because I think it's a good point.
Well, I think
in so much as we're talking about emotive,
MP got criticised for opposing it, and his reasons for opposing it apparently were not because he thought it was a good idea to be able to go around doing upskirting.
Of course not.
He just said that you don't need legislative creep to deal with it. You can deal with it under other legislation.
But I think it was deliberately chosen, and I think this is why it's not a bad example for you to bring up, even though it's uncomfortable, is because they will pick uncomfortable and emotive topics like child safety, precisely because you don't want to be the one who's going, let's do less for child safety. No one wants to be that guy.
Yeah.
But I think it's sometimes quite cynical.
Yeah.
Not always. I mean, I think a lot of the online safety bill is legitimate. And if this comes up when we chat to our Ofcom mate, I'm sure he'll argue that case, and I'm not going to push back on that. It's just that fringe, that margin, where the core thing that you can't argue. This is basically how a lot of stuff gets laundered. A lot of positions get laundered. A lot of Trojan horses are created. Is you get something no one can argue with. Everyone agrees. It's just, this is where you get the Godwin's law or whatever, where all conversations always end up invoking Hitler. Because Hitler's like the ultimate baddie.
He's the worst thing you can think of.
Yeah, so you compare anyone to Hitler, and that's like a conversation stopper. You see it happening a lot in US politics with Donald Trump. And it's lazy, but you can see why they do it, because if you pick something there's total unanimity on, that no one disagrees, this is bad or this is good, everyone agrees, and then you attach... It's almost like political, like big political packages where they attach like pork barrel spending and special interests to a core thing. Like in the States, I seem to remember a little while back, there was like a Ukraine funding bill, but there's all sorts of irrelevant shit being attached to it, like, building bridges to nowhere or whatever. Yeah. And I think that happens with causes.
Slovakia.
Yeah. I think that happens with causes. Is you'll find something that there's unanimity on, that everyone's going to agree on, and then you sort of sneakily attach ancillary, semi-related stuff to it in order to push that through as well.
That was the Patriot Act in 2001 as well, no? Or something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ever since 9/11, there's been a lot of US legislation that quite rightly... Well, there's a great example. So, like 9/11, you probably have never had a time of more total unanimity in the US than after 9/11, quite rightly. They were attacked. This appalling thing happened in New York. We got to fucking do something about it. And so no one's going to argue with any measures. I think George Bush Jr. was the president at the time.
Yeah.
Any measures he brings in, everyone's going to go, just go for it.
Yeah.
Just make sure this shit never happens again.
But also give us your data. Was it
but
like
also
that?
And also expand the powers of like CIA, FBI, NSA to spy on everyone, which is where we get to like Edward Snowden and all that sort of thing. So this happens, and it's fine. It's the real world, but I think it's part of the job of journalists, and maybe a self-appointed task of mine as the sort of small government libertarian guy, to just call it out. And just whenever you see this bureaucratic creep, as you describe it, Ian, coming, I think it's probably the biggest job of the press, certainly in covering current affairs, to be a check on that stuff. Because, we all know, you look at Eastern Bloc in the Cold War, it was through the total suppression of the press and the creation of like Pravda sort of state propaganda outlets that they're able to maintain that control. As long as there's a dissenting press, then the people who hold all the power, i.e. the politicians and maybe the oligarchs as well, are never, without a dissenting and uninhibited press, who else is going to hold them to account? Nobody.
Yeah, I worry about dissenting and uncontrollable press at the moment because...
Why is that?
Well, it just seems to be going the opposite way in terms of, institutions not being as impartial as they used to be.
Yeah.
Or
No, I hear you.
being able to get the funding that they used to get.
I hear you. The only thing I'll say, I agree with you on that when the legacy media, or some people say mainstream media.
Yeah.
But I think filling that gap is the indie sector. So you've got indie journalists like Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, Michael Schellenberger, those sorts of people. And then probably bigger than even than that is podcast sector, of which the exemplar is Joe Rogan.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Telecoms.com podcast.
Well, God, I'll tell you a really nice thing about being at Network X. I had quite a few people come up to me just randomly and say how much they like the podcast. And
that's good.
I know there's one lady who's just joined Nokia called Sandra. Hi, Sandra, if you're listening. And I chatted to her, and she's been outside of the telecoms industry for a while, and she's finding the podcast useful for just sort of getting her up to speed. Because, I know we get into the weeds a bit, but I think we try and talk in words of one syllable as much as we can.
Yeah.
But yes, things like Joe Rogan and the million other podcasts that are out there, talk about distributed intelligence and knowledge. They're all picking holes in. Like Trump is amazingly, he's, I'm not saying whether I'm pro or anti-Trump, and I'm not involving myself in the American political system. Just looking at his current tactic, it's to go on comedian podcasts with people like Theo Von and Andrew Schultz. And it's actually a natural place for him because he's actually quite a comedic person, Trump, believe it or not. He's got a real cheeky glint in his eye. And he was, obviously, before he got into politics, was just as well as being a real estate guy.
It's like doing a Saturday Night Live impersonation of him.
Yeah, well, and he's a narcissist as well. Oh yeah, he's totally a narcissist. But he's gone on these things, and he actually comes over quite well because he joins in the banter.
Yeah.
You know, like we always want, when people come on this pod, we always want them to be able to join in the banter. We don't want someone who's going to be too stiff, too on message.
Yeah.
They've got to be able to relax a bit, and over the course of 2 hours.
I mean, I'm not saying I'm a Donald Trump fan, but I'm not sure Kamala Harris can join in the banter. To be honest,
I don't think banter is really required to be a president, though.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, that's
a banterer.
Yeah, I think a president should be getting shit done. I don't know.
Well, obviously, you're completely right, Pierre. And I'm not saying...
And he's really good on policies and stuff, but his banter is a bit lacking.
But he knows how to talk shit for an hour or two with a comedian. No, I agree with you. If you're going to be the ostensible leader of the Western world, we like to have a bit more to you.
I don't know about you, but I'm voting on the basis of banter.
Bants. Well, I've got to say that was one of the reasons I liked Bojo back in the day. He kind of let me down on policy, but he gave good bants.
Alan Partridge would be a good prime minister.
Yeah, what was that clip you had? That's great banter.
This is great banter.
But anyway, the reason I bring it up is it's all changed. He's doing the podcast circuit. Whether or not he wins is another matter, but I think it's an interesting strategy that he's doing. And going on these things, just being normal as he can be. And there is a contrast there with Harris, who doesn't seem to be so spontaneous and so sure of her ability to just improvise. And Pierre, you make a great point. Who the fuck cares? What really matters is policies and competence and all that sort of thing.
I mean, only one of them said they're eating the dogs.
Well, but even that, I mean, this is a complete tangent.
I missed this.
So there was they did one of those little
debates,
like televised debates.
It's a waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, they're normally bullshit, those debates, but for people who are obsessed with
it, it's very low compared to what it used to be about 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, and part of that's Trump's fault because he does not operate at an elevated space when it comes to the discourse. But and he's not actually very good at these debates. But this thing came up, and they were talking about immigration, which is one of the big hot topics in the States for this election, as it is here and most other places. And he's not very well read.
He said he saw it on TV.
Yeah, or he even might have seen it on YouTube or fucking TikTok or something.
Yeah.
But there was some little rumour that there's this one little place, I think Springfield, Ohio, that happens to have quite a lot of Haitian immigrants in it. And there was one little rumour that these Haitian immigrants, or some of them, were nicking people's pets and eating them. So obviously there's some sort of very dodgy xenophobic connotations to that, unless it's true. And anyway, but he just blurts out in the middle of this fucking debate. He goes, "They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets." And I think Kamala Harris just looked at him, just jaw agape, just like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you just said that." And the thing is, I think it reflected badly on him because if in this important debate all he's doing is reciting some shit he's seen on the internet, that's not great. But the flip side is that's all anyone spoke about. So you get this, is there any such thing as bad publicity thing going on with him? Anyway, it was hilarious. So yeah, just to bring it back. So I think we kind of agree on the limits of where law should intervene. And I'll just point out another couple of quick things, and then I'll finish unless you've got anything else to say, Ian. I sort of collated a few other stories that I'd seen. There's a big US public policy polling company called Pew Research, and they saw that most American parents want smartphones banned in classrooms, but the minority want them banned entirely for the whole school. So I think that kind of goes against this guy McAllister's approach. In other words, they want a more nuanced solution. And then the last one is it's kind of only semi-related.
People are trying to ban things.
Well, exactly.
Let's ban it. There's a good solution.
It's authoritarian, and it's easier than being subtle and nuanced and bespoke.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, 3 UK has started, which I find a bit funny. They've started offering screen time clinics at their stores, so you can go in there, And this is a funny thing. I wrote this. I said, incidentally, 3UK has decided to offer screen time advice to adults on the back of research that shows an amazing third of British adults reckon they need help with that sort of thing. In other words, this research says that a third of people our age, or adults, think they need third-party help with managing their fucking screen time.
What's the main question? Why can't I get a service on your shit network?
Ooh, hello. Do you hear that, 3? You won't be taking him out and getting pissed, will you?
No, but that's the obvious thing people are getting right when they look at this story, isn't it? That they're coming into...
Anyway, and so they're doing that, and I thought that's funny. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. We're at time anyway.
I should just say that these days they would agree with me, wouldn't they?
Oh, of course, because their big narrative now is that we've got to merge.
We need to merge.
We've got to merge with Vodafone because we're so shit. Yeah, no, they've got some really counterintuitive messaging going on right now. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. Just to warn you, next one we'll probably have to do remotely, but Pierre's going to find out whether or not we can sneak into the office.
Going to check out the drilling.
But we will do one, and then we might not do one the week after because I'm going to be in Istanbul. Yeah, and it's half term and all that jazz. So savour this one. And make sure you join us for the next one whenever that turns up and in whatever form.